Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today's great political fiction is Atlas Shrugged by the Russian-American writer Ayn Rand, first published in 1957. It is, to be frank, not a work that has many great qualities as fiction. It's not a particularly good novel. But it has turned out to be extraordinarily powerful and influential. In fact, I think it's hard to conceive of a novel of the last 100 years that's done more to shape the contours of the world we live in today. I've never really read anything quite like Atlas Shrugged. I've never read a book like it. It is, apart from anything else, the longest book I've ever read. It's longer than War and Peace. It's longer than David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest. It's quite a lot longer than Middlemarch. It is, depending on the edition that you use and how it's printed, something like 1,200 pages, somewhere around 600,000 words. And to put that in perspective, that means it's 20 times longer than Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You get 20 Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hydes for one Atlas Shrugged. I read it on a Kindle, and as people who read on a Kindle will know, one of the challenges is it's quite hard sometimes to know where you are in a book when you're on a Kindle. You don't have the physical object in front of you. You can't sort of weigh it up and feel how long there is to go. And a Kindle will give you all sorts of different ways of measuring where you are in the book, the percentage you are in the book, the time left in the chapter, the time left in the book. With something like Atlas Shrugged, that starts to feel a little unreal. There were periods where I felt like I'd been reading for quite a long time, 20 minutes, half an hour, and I would look and I was still stuck on 32% or 68%. And the time left in the book felt like more time than I had left to me. I finished it last week. As it happens, I was in hospital. I just had a hip replacement operation, and I finally got to the end the day I came out of surgery. So I finished it through a haze of painkillers, which felt appropriate. And when I got to the final page, I felt like I'd climbed a mountain. It is also the most didactic book I think I've ever read, and I would include in that works of philosophy that are designed to convey a message or a moral. This is a novel in which Ayn Rand is absolutely determined that her readers will get the message. Page after page, scene after scene, each character is clearly designed to convey a point of view, which is her point of view, about what's good, what's bad, what should be supported, what should be reviled. And she really beats you around the head with it. She also structures the book around a series of very long speeches. So the characters in this book, part of the reason it's so long, is they are given full rein to express their views, their justifications, particularly for the things that they've done. They'll do something in the plot, and then you will get 5-10 pages of a single speech in which the character explains the philosophy behind the action, why it was done, why it makes sense. And if it's a good character, this will be genuine philosophy. And if it's one of the many bad characters, this will be obfuscation and deception. The longest speech in the book is towards the end, and it really is long. It's almost a whole chapter. I think it's something like 80 pages. I think it's roughly as long, this one speech, as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's given by what is the lead character in the book, the central character in the book, a man called John Galt, who, to start with, seems like he's a mythical figure, but then he turns out to be a real person. He is an entrepreneur, an engineer, a scientist. He's ridiculously heroic, good-looking, glamorous. And the plot that he is involved in, which becomes the central plot of the novel, is that he has persuaded the titans of American industry, the great entrepreneurs, the capitalists, the wealthy men, they're almost all men, not all, but almost all men, to go on strike. He is a passionate believer in free enterprise and the free market and capitalism as the only means by which human beings can make progress and can build a world that's worth living in. In a vision of an American future, it's a dystopian vision in which America has become a kind of generic socialist country run by a government that is not really American. So Ayn Rand deliberately changes the terms of the government. The president becomes the head of state to make it sound more generic and continental and somehow un-American and sinister. in that America, a form of socialism has taken hold. And John Galt leads the entrepreneurs of America, a very small group, just the absolute creme de la creme, the people who are really making the important stuff, building the companies of the future. He persuades them to down tools and effectively to disappear, to withdraw their labor from the market. They disappear and they go and live with him in a weird, hidden away commune somewhere in the middle of America. They, to all intents and purposes for the rest of the country, they've just vanished. But what they are actually doing is going on strike in order to demonstrate that there is no sustainable future for America, for any kind of modern capitalist economy, without the few people who make it work, the entrepreneurs, the superstars of industry who build the companies, who make the products, who make the money, who become rich. These people aren't on strike because they are sulking about the fact that they become poor. They are, most of them, still very rich, but they're sulking about the fact that no one recognizes that they are the ones who are adding value. So John Galt persuades them one by one to disappear. And the effect is that a country that has been falling apart because it's being run by socialists falls apart completely. Without these men to drive the economy, to drive industry, nothing works. And the government gets more and more panicked and more scared. And towards the end of the book, there is a set piece occasion where the head of state is going to engineer a radio address in which various people are going to try and rally the morale of the nation and try and explain what's going on. And John Galt hacks this radio broadcast. So just when people are expecting the official message of the government, in comes this voice, John Galt, and he uses the opportunity to lay out his personal philosophy. And in the book, it says it took him 3 hours. But when you read it, I think it was a lot longer than 3 hours. I don't think you get through that volume of words in 3 hours. He goes on and on and on about the nature of good and evil and freedom, about what it means to add value to the world, about who are the people who are adding the value, him and his little crew, and who are the many people who are destroying the value and ultimately resorting to violence. And then he says it again and again in a different form and again. The implication in the book is that his audience is rapt across America when this voice breaks in, the voice of reason, literally of reason, breaks in. People are suddenly captured by the truth. Actually, when you read it, it's hard to believe that anyone would have stuck with it unless you were being forced to listen to this broadcast at the point of a gun. I think most people probably would have switched off. It's that kind of book. Nothing is allowed to escape your attention. And just in case you might have switched off as a reader, as a listener in the fiction, Ayn Rand tells you again and again what it is she wants you to understand. And yet, despite all of this, it works. It's not a good novel, but it is a powerful novel. It is compelling. She does get her message across. No one, I think, can finish Atlas Shrugged and not be completely clear about what Rand thinks is good: free market, entrepreneurship, wealth and wealth creation, and what she thinks is evil: government interference, regulation, posturing intellectuals, university types thinking that they know what justice is, and so on. It's a crystal clear, very, very, very long book. But the thing that's most striking about reading it now, and I'd never read it before, is how contemporary it feels. It was published nearly 70 years ago, and some of it is obviously incredibly dated. It seems to be set in a kind of version of America which is an extension of the New Deal. My understanding of what she's doing in this book in 1957 is imagining an America in which there hadn't been a Second World War. So the New Deal of the 1930s, that was an attempt to deal with the Great Depression, had kind of run into the sand by the end of the 1930s, and it had got bogged down in government and bureaucracy. And then the war came, and the war galvanized the American state, American industry, and changed the nature of American society. But this is a vision of an America in which there hadn't been a war. There's no mention of there having been a Second World War, in which somehow the grinding, stuck quality of New Deal, Great Depression politics gets worse and worse and more socialist, and what would happen as a consequence of that. So that doesn't feel particularly contemporary, and the gender politics, which I'll come on to, definitely don't feel very contemporary. But some of the themes are the themes of now, and particularly they are the themes of a world dominated by a new kind of industrial entrepreneurship, the new titans of industry, the men, almost all men, of Silicon Valley, the Elon Musks, the Steve Jobs. The world that those people built feels very much like it is the world of Atlas Shrugged, partly because, so it is said, they all read this novel when they were teenagers, and they really did drink the Kool-Aid. But the book is full of talking points that are the talking points of now. People express absolute contempt and ridicule for universities and public intellectuals and government experts. I don't think there's any phrase in this book that comes dripping with more contempt than when one of the good characters uses the phrase government expert. It's a book which is deeply skeptical of democracy and the wisdom of public opinion because it's felt that it's so easily manipulable and so easily manipulated against the efforts of the few superstars of industry who are the ones who are building the society of the future. It is on the side of the few, the elite few, against the many. It feels like it's part of our culture wars. And I suspect that's partly because the engineers, some of the engineers, literal engineers, of our culture wars read this book when they were kids. But it's also, it resonates in little tiny ways. You read the book and suddenly certain things stand out and you think, oh, that's where that comes from. And I just want to give one example here. Part of the plot of the book is about a pair of siblings, a brother and a sister, James Taggart and Dagny Taggart. Dagny Taggart is the heroine of the book. She is the central character. John Galt is the mythic central figure, but the core character in the narrative is Dagny Taggart. She and her brother have inherited a railroad business, a big railroad empire, this big company that was built by one of their ancestors. The boy, James Taggart, the man, but he's really a boy. He's like a schoolboy. He inherits because there's some version of primogeniture going on here. It's assumed that he will be in charge. But we know from very early on that she is the dynamo. He's weak, she's strong. He's needy and she's brave. She's the one who actually has an idea of how to rescue this business. Ultimately, she comes to understand the only way to rescue it is to go along with John Galt's plan and to withdraw from this society which is failing. Towards the end of the book, there is a scene where it's becoming clear to James Taggart that he has lost this business that was meant to be his inheritance by right. And this scene is straight out of the TV series Succession, the TV series that finished last year. James Taggart is Kendall Roy. Dagny Taggart is Shiv Roy, or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe Kendall Roy is James Taggart. Towards the end of Succession, after Logan Roy has died and they're fighting it out, the siblings, for control of the business empire, there is a scene when Kendall Roy thinks that he's finally got the crown. He's finally going to inherit the throne. And then it's taken away from him at the last minute. And he breaks down like a child and he starts whimpering like a child. And he says that he just wants it. It's just meant to be his. It's his by right. No one's allowed to take it away from him. He says, I want to run a company like this. I kind of feel like it's what I want to do. Exactly the same scene happens in Atlas Shrugged. At the end of the book, it becomes clear to James Taggart that he is going to lose his position. And he says to his sister, I quote, Dagny, his voice was the soft, nasal, monotonous whine of a beggar. I want to be president of a railroad. I want it. Why can't I have my wish as you always have yours? Pure Kendall Roy, or rather Kendall Roy is pure James Taggart. Because this is such a didactic book, it is also a work of philosophy as well as a work of fiction. It was the last novel that Ayn Rand wrote. She'd written a very successful earlier one called The Fountainhead, which was a similar story about a heroic society-bucking architect and his will to power. This one was the last time she tried to do it through fiction. After this, she wrote philosophy, her philosophy. She came up with a philosophy and she gave it a name. She called it objectivism. She wanted to call it existentialism, but she found that that name had already been taken. So objectivism was her second best. And Atlas Shrugged is her attempt to write an objectivist novel. So the characters in it all play a part in objectivist philosophy, and they are either the spokespeople for that philosophy, or they are the exemplification of what that philosophy thinks is evil. It's not that easy to sum up what objectivism is, but it has a few core ideas that are, I think, relatively straightforward. Ayn Rand believed, as an objectivist, that what makes us distinct as human beings is our capacity for reason, to think rationally about the world. And that the world that we think rationally about is the material world, and it is real. It is really out there. The material world is real. So objectivism is against perspectivism and all the various forms, as she saw it, of philosophical solipsism that said that the world is what we make it, what we imagine it to be, how we construct it. No, no, no. The world is objective reality. It is material reality. And what we are capable of doing as human beings, thinking creatures, is to build something out of it. Indeed, our task as human beings, what it means to be free as a human being, is our ability to construct from the world of material reality a new material reality, one that works better for us, better machines, better systems, better ways of living, things that will save us time, things that will give us more power, things that will give us more control over nature. It is about molding objective reality through the force of reason so that it suits our purposes. That's what it means to be human. And that philosophy in this novel cuts across everything. So it is what these entrepreneurs are doing, building their railroad empires or their steel businesses. So one of the lead characters, Hank Rearden, has invented a new kind of steel, a better kind of steel. This is the quintessential way in which a rational human being can impose himself on objective reality, take what exists and make it better by the application of human intelligence and force. Not political force, but the force of controlling material objects in new ways. It's there from business through to personal relationships through to sex. The sex in this book is frankly pretty weird. There's quite a lot of it. It's not described graphically because this is still the 1950s. So it's got that creepy 1950s quality where it's euphemistic, but the euphemisms are almost more explicit than the thing itself. So various acts are described as animalistic and vicious and depraved, and you're meant to fill in the gaps. And in these sexual acts, men dominate women because this is still a world in which men dominate women, but some women, particularly Dagny Taggart, are able through their own mastery, through their own ability to grasp objective reality, to be worthy exchangers of this sexual act for these men. And it is a kind of exchange, and it's weirdly an extension of business. So even Dagny Taggart thought, and again I quote, that there was some unbreakable link between her love for her work and the desire of her body. Sex, for Rand, is objectification. It is possession. That's the point of it, because objectification and possession is how human beings assert themselves in this world, how they express their freedom. It's weird. At the same time, there is objectivism, but this is a world in which almost everyone is living by other rules. So the few, the elite, the people who are capable of mastering steel and sex, live those kinds of lives. But almost everyone else has fallen under the sway of what Rand calls in the book and in her philosophy, different forms of mysticism or mystification. So mystification includes all those ways of understanding the world through which the world is turned into something that suits what we want. A bit like James Taggart. I want to be president. I want it. Trying to make a world that fits what we want it to be, rather than trying to rebuild a world that will work differently and therefore suit our wants. So the mystifiers include everything from the purveyors of religion, which is all, for Rand, a form of mystification, through to the purveyors of secular religion, like socialism and philosophies of justice and fairness, all of the purveyors of those university disciplines like sociology or social criticism that tried to deconstruct and reconstruct the world using words, not using steel or sex, but words. All of that is mysticism, is mystification. Democracy is a form of mystification, pandering to a version of what the people want. I want this, I want that, they say. I want a fairer society. I want welfare. I don't want to have to work so hard. They're all versions of the sulky boy who wants to be head of the railroad. All of that is mystification. And this is a book of very clean lines. You're either on the side of objective reality or you are one of the mystifiers. And the mystifiers are definitely the majority at this point in American history, the manipulators of public opinion, the manipulators of intellectual disciplines. Rand says that there are only two subjects she really thinks that people should study, philosophy and physics. Philosophy for her means Aristotle and one or two others, and physics means physics. And all the rest is frankly mystification, and bullshit. But the bullshit is winning until John Galt stops it. She was very proud of the fact that this was her philosophy. She was not entirely self-taught, but she had many of the qualities of an autodidact, and she totally believed that she had seen things that other people hadn't. She had a kind of clarity of vision that comes through in her fiction. It's very rare to read a novel where the author has so little self-doubt. But it is a philosophy that's made up of all sorts of other influences, and they come through in this book in lots of different ways. She has clearly been reading a lot of other people's writings, not their fiction, but their philosophy or their economic theory or their political theory. And this book is an attempt to put some of these theories into fictional form, to do them as stories, a story about a heroic group of people who rescue America from the dead hand of socialism and oppression. One of the philosophers by whom she was most influenced was Nietzsche. By the time she wrote Atlas Shrugged, she'd moved away from Nietzsche, and she talked about this quite a lot in interviews and in her writing. The Fountainhead was a more obviously Nietzschean book, but certainly in her early life, Nietzsche was her god. Nietzsche was the lodestar to whom she turned her work. And plenty of that is still there in Atlas Shrugged. And one of its central themes is a theme lifted straight from Nietzsche, which is something I've talked about before on this podcast, on this series. I talked about it in relation to Middlemarch. It's the idea of where the power of the powerless comes from. What is it that gives people who lack power in a world of, as Ayn Rand would say, of objective material reality? Where do they get their hold over other human beings, the weak, the inadequate, the ones who don't know how to create a new kind of steel? And her answer can be summed up in a single word. She thinks the tool that the weak use to gain power over the strong in personal relationships, in business relationships, in politics is guilt. Guilt and shame. They try to make the successful ones, the builders, the manufacturers, the ones who are turning material reality into something new and something better, and thereby benefiting from it, becoming rich, becoming successful, being happy, being fulfilled. They try to make them feel guilty about it. Guilt and shame. And they try to make them pity everyone else. She says, and she puts these words into the mouths of one of her good characters, there is nothing more contemptible than the man who uses another's pity for him as a weapon, tries to get the powerful one to feel pity and then turns that pity back to control the powerful one. When John Galt has to explain what it is he has led his little heroic troop of industrial entrepreneurs on strike for, he says, we are on strike against the doctrine that life is guilt. We do not believe we have anything to feel guilty about because we are more successful than you, because we have made so much more money than you, because we have built things that you want. You want. And in this case, you're willing to pay for them. You want them so badly. You don't just want them to be given to you. You're willing to pay for them, for better railroads, for more efficient industrial products, for things that make your lives go better and smoother and that save you time. We refuse to feel guilty about that. And yet, the claim is we're living in a world, this world of social justice and of state control and state regulation, which is built on the idea that the most successful people owe something back to the people from whom they have derived their success. So this is the fallacy for Rand. The fallacy is the social justice idea that there is an obligation because you wouldn't be the person that you were, the successful person running this successful business, without the infrastructure of bureaucracy that supports you, without the hard work of all the people who work on the production line that produce these products. And John Galt's point is to say, right, let's put this to the test. Let's just withdraw us. Let's keep everything else in place. Let's keep in place all the bureaucracy, all the regulation, all the workers, all the factories, all the systems, all the production lines, and let's just take out the Elon Musks, the Steve Jobs, whoever they are. What will happen? And in the book, what happens is the country collapses into poverty and dictatorship. But the point is to prove that they don't owe anything back. If anything, it is owed to them. That is, whatever they have is theirs by right. That idea that the power of the weak over the strong is guilt, shame, and pity comes straight from Nietzsche. But where Rand parts from Nietzsche in this book is that, unlike Nietzsche, who wants to move beyond morality, as he says, beyond good and evil, Nietzsche, who had come to understand that it's all a construct. Actually, there isn't an objective material reality out there which is accessible to the most rational minds. We all construct a version of the world which suits our interests. Rand wants to believe that there is still an objective reality that is accessible to a few elite minds. And on the basis of that, it is possible to be astonishingly dogmatic about what is good and what is evil. So this is not a Nietzschean book. It's actually a less Nietzschean book than Middlemarch because it is shot through with the language of good and evil. There isn't a word, I think, that is used more often in this book to describe something that is really, really bad than that it is evil. And the things that are evil for Rand are government regulation and social welfare and philosophies of justice and doctrines of guilt. Evil, 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 evil. This is still a world of objective morality. So the weird thing is, I have no idea what Nietzsche would have thought of Atlas Shrugged. I can guess, and I don't think he would have been all that impressed. But I think the irony is that his criticism of Middlemarch is actually more fairly, or would be more fairly, directed at this book. I don't think George Eliot, if you remember, Nietzsche says of her that she's one of those little lady novelists who's emancipated herself from morality and then gets scared and has to reinvent a morality to put in its place. Don't think that is true of George Eliot, but it is true of Ayn Rand. In the end, she doesn't feel safe living without being able to draw the line between good and evil. And drawing the line between good and evil, actually, Nietzsche thought, was one of the tools of the weak, not of the strong. The book has plenty of other philosophies and theories in it too, quite a few of them based on the economics of the time. So one of the books that Ayn Rand had read and is channeling in Atlas Shrugged is Friedrich Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, which made the argument that any attempt at government regulation and control of industry in the name of social justice or social fairness was a slippery slope to serfdom, to dictatorship, to total government control. And Ayn Rand tries to give a narrative version of that argument in this book. We are shown the slippery slope. Hayek's case was based on the idea that once governments start giving way to demands for I want, different interest groups saying it's not fair they've got it, why haven't I got it? It's not fair that these people are rich and that I'm poor. It'll be impossible to withstand the demands of anyone. It suddenly becomes an auction of promises in which there is no end. If they've got it, then they want it. And if they've got it, then they want it, and so on. So it'll be ratcheted up and up and up. And that's what happens in this book. This government finds itself constantly having to pander to the next group who say, well, if they've had it, we want it. And at the same time, Hayek thinks, once you go down that road, the thing that generates the capacity to meet people's demands, which is economic growth, will start to fall away because government control will stifle economic growth. It will stifle the workings of the free market, which is the only means by which human beings actually find out what it is they want, because the only test of what human beings actually want is what they're willing to pay for. So two things happen on this slippery slope. On the one hand, more and more people demand more and more things. And on the other hand, there are less and less resources for government to meet those demands. And the only possible response of any government is to try to exercise more control, to contain the resources, to meet the demands, to try and actually, in the end, damp down or stifle the demands by force if necessary. Hayek believed that any government in this situation, when faced with this dilemma, would make the problem worse. More demands means more government control. More government control means less resources available. Less resources available means more bleating demands. More bleating demands means more government control. One of the characters in this book, at a moment of crisis where he's told nothing is working anymore, these entrepreneurs, these industrialists have disappeared, their industries aren't working, the workers aren't being paid, the trains aren't running, the tracks are breaking down. This is an industrial society in which industry is grinding to a halt. He says, or he shrieks, I can't help it. I can't do anything about it. I need wider powers. That, Hayek and Rand believes, is the response of every government official under these circumstances, faced with the failure of control, which is to demand more control. And in this book, it ends with demands for total control that ultimately break down in chaos. This is also a book that was influenced in the 50s by the growth of what came to be known as public choice theory in economics, which was a doctrine that said it's an illusion to think that the economy is divided into two sectors, the free market, profit-seeking capitalist sector in which people are trying to make money, and then the public sector, government, non-government organizations, but organizations working towards welfare or justice or whatever it is, where people are motivated by some other factor. So in government or in other forms of public life, they're not after profit. If they were after profit, they would be in business. These are people who want to make the world a better place in different ways. And public choice theory says that's not true. Everyone is the same. We're all economic creatures with the same motivations, self-interest, and self-interest ultimately means we want to extract some value from the situation we find ourselves in. We want to make money. They're all in it for the money. Government officials as much as anyone else. Government officials make money in a different way from people in business. They make money by force, by extraction. In the slightly jargony term, they seek rent, they extract rent by using their monopoly over force, over coercion to require people to pay through taxes, through regulations, through state control. Atlas Shrugged is a version of that argument. It is trying to say, look at these people in government talking, bleating this mystification language of justice and fairness and equality for all and guilt and shame and pity. And look at what they're actually doing. What they're actually doing is trying to extract value for themselves. They're trying to make money for themselves. Rand divides the world of the villains, which is almost all of us, apart from her few heroes, into moochers and looters. The moochers are the people who make money out of government by mooching on government, by bleating, by saying, I want more, give me some more, I want something. The James Taggarts at the top end, the industrialists who are reliant on the government purse, right down to the people at the bottom end who don't have a job and want the government to help them out. They want the government to give them welfare so that they don't have to work. Those are the moochers, but worse than the moochers are the looters. The looters are the ruthless, steely-eyed men in government who are using the fact that they control the army and the police to take money from people who have made it in other ways, to take money from the wealthy, to take money from industry, and to spend it on their own projects. And again, she's trying to tell over the course of 1,200 pages how once you get on that slope, it ends with total oppression, extreme violence. The looters, in the end, build a torture machine to torture the people who won't do it their way. This is also a book, I think, that was influenced by another economist, Joseph Schumpeter, and his theory of capitalism. For Schumpeter, one of the paradoxes of capitalism is it depends on the élan, the animal spirits of the entrepreneurial types, the rare entrepreneurial types who are willing to take risks, to be the brave ones who go out there and forge the future. But capitalism is also a family business. Most of these companies are family companies. And often the people who do this, these high-spirited, free-spirited entrepreneurs, are doing it because they want to build something for their children. But when the children inherit, they mess it up. Why do they mess it up? Well, it may be because actually they don't inherit the élan, the capitalist spirit, but also because they feel guilty. One of the paradoxes is the easiest way to use the doctrine of guilt to get it back from these people is to make the kids feel guilty about inheriting the money from the parents. Too many of the children of wealthy capitalists end up actually gratefully handing the money over to the government because they think it will salve their conscience and salve their soul. And there are plenty of those kind of characters in this book too. So it's a kind of amalgam of these different serious and influential philosophies through these stock characters, these almost caricatured characters, each of which embodies a version of this. The looter, the moocher, the guilty child of the wealthy parent. On and on it goes, across all of these different characters. But the force of the book isn't actually in that amalgam of ideas. It's not in what she's trying to get across. It's in what she hates. My God, she's a good hater. The hatred in this book, the contempt for some of the characters and what they represent is so real. It's so visceral. It drips off the page. And though this is a long and it's a hard slog, this book, sometimes it's absolutely exhilarating. God, she hates intellectuals. God, she hates people who work in universities. God, she hates people who talk about social justice. God, she hates people who try and make the wealthy feel guilty about their wealth. God, she hates the journalists who pander to these people, the journalists who will parrot the lines of the politicians or who will parrot the lines of the intellectuals. She hates the PR people who dress up the world as something that it's not. She hates the politicians who pander to the public. She hates many of the characters in her book. She kills them off in various ways because she hates them so much. She hates certain individuals. One of the characters channels her hatred of the economist John Maynard Keynes, the economist who was often at this period set against Hayek. And she thought she was living in a world in which Keynes's ideas had won, and she wanted to scream against that. One of the most unpleasant characters in the book is a government apparatchik called Cuffy Meigs, who ends up in charge of the unified railroad system. So all of the different railroad companies that have been competing against each other to make money, which is how the system works. It's the only way the system can work, she thinks. The government decides that to make it fairer, all of these railroads have to be amalgamated into a single body run by a single government apparatchik. It's this man, Meigs. And when it's pointed out to him at various times that it's not going very well, that actually the railroads are much, much worse than they used to be when it was competitive, and that in the long run, the whole thing is going to fall apart. He says, because it's his catchphrase in the book, in the long run, we'll all be dead. That phrase was indelibly associated with John Maynard Keynes. And yet the person that she hates most in this book is not a government official. It is not actually one of the looters or the moochers. It is a scientist. It's a physicist. There is a character in the book called Robert Stadler, whom Rand describes as the epitome of evil. He is repeatedly characterized as the worst of all of them. He is the one that John Galt hates most. He was John Galt's teacher at university. John Galt learnt physics from Robert Stadler. So there is some kind of Oedipal revenge going on here. But Stadler is loathed by Ayn Rand for a range of reasons. And after the book was published, it became clear, and she allowed it to be known, that she had based him on a real person. The person Stadler was based on is Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the nuclear bomb, the man about whom the brilliant, very successful film was made last year. That Oppenheimer is the person in this book that Ayn Rand hates more than anyone else. He is, in her words, the embodiment of human evil. Now, it's not because he built the bomb. It's not that argument. Why did she hate him so much? Some of it seems to be to do with the fact that after the war, she was commissioned by a Hollywood studio to write the screenplay for a biopic about Oppenheimer and about the Manhattan Project. So the film that was eventually made just last year was originally going to be made with a screenplay by Ayn Rand. And she went to interview Oppenheimer for this. And she did write this screenplay. It never got made. Apparently, it was no good. Part of the reason it was no good is, as was her wont, she was determined to make it a very didactic story. She wanted there to be a clear moral about the Manhattan Project, which is that this was not a government project. The success of it, the amazing success of the intellectual endeavor to create this thing. I mean, after all, this is really remolding material reality in a way that changes everything. That extraordinary success was the product of free-thinking men living in a free environment, uncontrolled by government regulators, so that they could be true to themselves. And Oppenheimer didn't quite give her that story. She tried to get it out of him, but it wasn't really true. This was also a government project. And she hated the fact that Oppenheimer allowed it to be a government project and that he put his incredible invention simply in the hands of politicians and bureaucrats. And she thought that the world was a much, much more dangerous place, not because Oppenheimer had built the bomb, because if the bomb was in the hands of entrepreneurs, it would never be used. Because as she says explicitly in Atlas Shrugged, serious business people never contemplate destruction on that scale. It is only politicians and apparatchiks and moochers and looters. Oppenheimer's great sin was to have put this weapon in the hands of the moochers and the looters. And then he did two things that made it even worse. He became a public intellectual. He went to Princeton to run the Institute for Advanced Studies, this new hothouse environment, academic environment in which he brought together scientists and physicists with novelists and historians and philosophers, and allowed them, in Rand's mind, to talk rubbish to each other. The physicists should be out there in the world making a new world. They shouldn't be in Princeton having nice meals and talking to T.S. Eliot about poetry. And he also did the other thing that she thinks is unforgivable. When Oppenheimer had his own doubts about the bomb and the thing that he had put into the hands of government, he played to public opinion. He played on people's fears and feelings of guilt and anxiety in order to try and get back control over this project. He hawked himself around the TV studios. He allowed the idiotic journalists to question him. He was meant to be the heroic physicist. He was meant to be John Galt. John Galt is the man who never hawks himself around to anyone. He does his thing. He builds his stuff. And then his stuff is used by people like him to make the world a more productive place. Oppenheimer didn't just sell out. Oppenheimer allowed himself to become a figurehead for government, for TV, for public opinion, for universities, for the things that Ayn Rand hated. And in the novel, what happens to Stadler? Stadler is responsible under this nightmarish dystopian government for a new military project, which is called Project X. He's building another secret weapon. And when everything falls apart, and when, thanks to John Galt's strike, the country is effectively on the brink of civil war, he tries to go back and reclaim control of this weapon, of Project X. He tries to rescue it from the people who have taken it and are using it for nefarious purposes. But Cuffy Meigs is also trying to regain control of Project X. And in a kind of classic Ayn Rand fantasy, John Maynard Keynes and Robert Oppenheimer are fighting for control of a weapon that goes off and kills them both and everyone in a 100-mile radius. It's that kind of book. But its resonance today isn't really because of what it has to say about arguments in 1950s economic theory and political theory. It's only in part because of the side it takes, Hayek versus Keynes. It's not really resonant today because of Oppenheimer. The resonance today, its central place in our culture, is because of the ways in which it seems eerily to foreshadow so many of the arguments and the justifications that are made by the people who are the new industrial titans of our world. The ones who have built the companies in the last 10, 15, 20 years that are the dominant industrial bodies of our age, the Amazons, the Apples, the Facebooks, now Meta, the Google, now Alphabet. And those men, all of the men, many of them quite young when they started, who are the heroic figures in their own stories, the men who built these companies from nothing, who created something that didn't exist, who changed material reality, who became wealthier than it was possible to imagine anyone could become in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, who generated a huge, vast backlash from people who said this kind of wealth must be illicit in some way. It's not possible to become this wealthy so quickly without doing something that is essentially a form of theft. And these people and their industries, they almost celebrate that contempt. They almost wear it as a badge of honor. The ways in which the wider public, the bleating intellectuals, the whiny democratic politicians are playing catch up with a world that they're constantly rebuilding and reinventing and becoming unfathomably rich on the back of. And why do they welcome it? I think it's partly because they read this book. And this book makes it clear that that is one of the markers, one of the badges of honor in this world. If the moochers and the looters are whining about you, you're doing something right. If you become very, very rich very, very quickly because you have made something that effectively captures a monopoly of a market that didn't even exist before, you are remaking objective reality and they can't bear it. And the reason they can't bear it is they think that reality is what they say it is because they try and remake it through words and through laws and through conventions and through their morality. Whereas you elite few young men are remaking it through machinery. In Atlas Shrugged, machinery is described as the frozen embodiment of human intelligence. This is a celebration, apart from anything, of industrial technology. So this is pre-digital industrial technology. In 1957, this is very much steel and oil and railroads and motor cars. But it is still thought that the machine is the purest version of human reason in material form. And that is what the Silicon Valley titans are doing again. New kinds of machines, new versions of material reality, changing the way we all live. And we complain about it, but we also, all of us, adopt it because we can't live without it, because they have made a new world for us. And because they have made a new world for us, according to the philosophy in Atlas Shrugged, we have nothing to complain about. And the one thing that we should not do is make them feel guilty about anything that they have done. It is not unfair that they have become so rich, according to the philosophy in this book. It is the definition of fairness. To say that it is unfair that someone who has built a product on which we all come to depend very quickly, thereby making that person rich in the way that only a monopolist can become rich, to call that unfair is, in the language of Atlas Shrugged, evil. So I totally get why this is a book that would speak to the builders of the new dominant industries of the 21st century. It feels like it was written for them. And I suspect to some of them now, it feels like they are living it out. They are actually the people who are showing that what was written in Atlas Shrugged is, at some objective level, true. But it's not true. And it's not true because actually there isn't really a fit here. It's easy at a superficial level to see Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg or Steve Jobs as a version of the characters that Ayn Rand celebrated and valorized. And in some of their public pronouncements, in their personae, in the way they conduct themselves in the world, they feel like they are Randian characters, but not in the way they do business. One of the marks of being a good guy in Ayn Rand's world is you don't take any government money. So one of her characters, Hank Rearden, is described, and he's marked out in these terms, as someone who never sought any loans, bonds, subsidies, land grants, or legislative favors from the government. That is the mark of his moral strength and moral purity. And that is just not true of any of these people in Silicon Valley. They all of them, have built their businesses in part, by no means in whole, but in part on the back of loans, bonds, subsidies, land grants, and legislative favors, particularly legislative favors from government. They are not Hank Reardens. One of the arguments in Atlas Shrugged against government experts and bureaucrats trying to regulate industry is they always slow it down. They're always the people who will put a barrier in the way and say, it's not safe, it's not ready to go to market. You've invented this amazing new kind of steel. We can't try it out yet until we spent a year testing to see whether the bridge that you're building or the rail track that you're building using it will work. Will it fall down? Will it buckle? And the entrepreneur says the only test of whether it will work is to try it out and see if people will use it. And of course, the downside of that is if it doesn't work, if the bridge falls down, well, people are going to die. So it is understandable. I think even Rand understands that government regulators will be nervous about the thought that entrepreneurs are the ones who judge when their product is safe to go to market. So in this novel, she gets her characters to do the thing that they have to do to show that they are truly the heroes of this story, which is they don't want government regulators to tell them when their product is safe, but also they are aware that it's not a good look if they try it out and people die. So they will be the guinea pigs for their own product. The first time that the train goes on that train track, the first time that it goes over that bridge, the people who run the company will be on the train. So if the bridge goes down and if the train goes down, they die with it. They die with their idea. And to be a true Randian hero, you have to test your product on yourself and see whether people die before you roll it out. And that does not happen in Silicon Valley. I think one of the distinguishing characteristics of the people who are making obscene fortunes in Silicon Valley is how very, very wary they are of their own products, how much time and effort they spend trying to protect themselves and particularly their children from the things that they are making available freely and readily to everyone else, because I think they know the harm it does and the damage it does. They don't want any government regulation. The idea that online technology should be regulated like the pharmaceutical industry because people die, because they do harm to people's health. They don't want any of that. That is just the dead hand of the state getting in the way of objective material progress. But they also don't do the other thing that Rand thinks you ought to do, which is road test it on themselves. They road test it on us. That is not a Randian way of doing politics or of doing economics. In Atlas Shrugged, she says the thing that these people are all trying to do is to save us time. When material reality is remolded with a new product so that it works better, what it does is it liberates the human mind because it gives us more time. The trains run faster, they run more efficiently. The point of efficiency is to free up the human mind, the human soul, to free up the human experience from the dead hand of a material reality that clogs it up when it's really time-consuming and slow to do something, to get somewhere, to achieve something. Any machinery that speeds that up liberates us. And that is part of the rhetoric of Silicon Valley technology. It is the great liberating technology. It's the thing that will finally free us up from the drudgery and the dead hand of bureaucracy and paper and form filling. And it will free us up to live lives of imagination and leisure and luxury. And it's all bullshit because it hasn't freed us up at all. It is not like a train that gets you there twice as quick. One of the ironies of the last 30 or 40 years is transport has not got any quicker. For Ayn Rand, this is the test. The real test of progress is physical distance and the speed with which human beings can travel. There's been no progress in that. Information moves faster, but the speed with which information moves has not freed us up. It has drowned us in too much information that is not properly filtered by the technology which has allowed it to travel so quickly. Nothing about the world we live in feels to me like Ayn Rand's heroic version of the masters of the universe saving us time. Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, they may have read this book when they were younger, and at various points in their careers, they may have gone back to it in their heads and thought, God, isn't it good to show that she was right? But the thing that's missing from Atlas Shrugged, the reason it doesn't work as a novel, though it works extraordinarily well as a piece of didactic, being beaten around the head, pseudo-novelistic philosophizing, is that it's too clean. The lines are too clean between the good guys and the bad guys. The presiding motif of the book is an image of clean lines, the clean lines of architecture, of train tracks, of movement, of machines, of progress, of human faces. When she has her excruciating sex scenes, they tend to be described in the language of sharp cheekbones and sharp limbs and the line of the clothing as it comes off to reveal the even sharper and cooler line of the body. Everything is sharp and linear in this world. And that is not the objective reality of the world we live in, which just is messier. It just is blurrier. And the thing that is missing above all from Atlas Shrugged, the reason it is such a schematic book, you know from the beginning where you're going. I can't think of a single scene in the book that doesn't work like clockwork, and I don't mean that in a good way. It doesn't work so that you know exactly where you're meant to end up, and it's engineered so that each person pops out in the place they're meant to pop out. What is missing from the story is chance, or luck, or randomness. Everything in the end follows its track. And if it's a good track, it ends up good. And if it's an evil track, it ends up evil. And it's only by the people who withdraw their labor that they are able to wrench an entire society off the evil track back onto the good track. There's no luck in this story. The people who do well deserve to do well. The people who do ill are doing ill because they are evil doers. And that's the myth that this book is trying to create, that if you do end up on top in a world in which a small group of human beings invent new products, which then go to market and make them extraordinarily wealthy, it is because you had something that no one else had, rather than it being luck. But just think of the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, I'm guessing, of ambitious young men, techie boys, geeky boys who read this book and thought that they could live it. And a few of them did, a handful of them did, and almost all of the others didn't. Is it the case that the others didn't because the few who did were the few who happened to have the ideas that were capable of changing material reality? Or is it because the few who did were the lucky ones? So I think the analogy here is a bit like with dreams. If you think of a country like America or Britain, let's take America, where everybody goes to bed at night and everybody sleeps. It's one of the great equalizers, sleep. Even the tech titans sleep. And not everybody dreams. Some people dream, some people don't dream. Some people have vivid dreams. Some people can't remember their dreams. Some people's vivid dreams are mad and surreal and nonsensical, but some of them are very specific and they're about their own lives and things that might happen to them. So this is a subset of a subset. But every night in America, millions of people have a dream which is quite specific and it feels like it's about their lives. They meet someone they haven't seen for 20 or 30 years. They find an object that's been missing forever. They get an idea that turns out to be incredibly useful. And almost all of those dreams will have no bearing on reality because they're dreams. But by the laws of chance, by the laws of probability, every day, one or two people will wake up in America and the thing they dreamt last night will come true. They dream that they meet someone they haven't seen for 30 years, and then that day they meet that person. They dream about an object they've been looking for, and they dream that it's behind some piece of furniture in their house. And then they think, well, I might as well look, and it's there. It'll happen to almost no one, but it will happen to some people, just by chance. If you were one of those people, if I was one of those people, I would believe in the power of dreams. I would think I had a prophetic gift. It would be almost impossible to think that was just a coincidence. You hadn't seen someone for 30 years. You dream about them that night. The next morning, they show up on your doorstep. You are some kind of prophet. You have some special gift. I think the people who have made it in Silicon Valley are like the people whose dreams came true the night before. And we know about them because when your dreams come true, my God, everybody hears about it. And we don't hear about all of the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people whose dreams don't come true. Why did their dreams come true? It's not because they're prophets. It is mainly chance. And to believe that dream reality is reality because it happened to you, to believe that dreams are a version of objective reality, that seems to me to be the ultimate mystification. Sign up now for PPF Plus if you would like to get bonus episodes to accompany this, past series, future series, and ad-free listening. Just go to ppfideas.com or click on the link in the show description. We've got a couple more episodes in this series before we start talking about British politics and the idea behind British general elections. That's going to be coming soon, with the historian Robert Saunders starting with the general election of 1906. But the next great political fiction is a great one. It's not a novel that is important, but not a good novel. It is Salman Rushdie's great novel, Midnight's Children, the great novel of India, modern Indian politics, of democracy, and of the body politic itself. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.